Grace had run a little grilled skewer stand at the Portland Farmers Market for years. She worked the early hours, rain or shine, hands smelling of garlic and smoke apron, faded by 100 summers. On this grey afternoon, the clouds sat low over the Willamette, thick as wet wool. A new gourmet food truck had parked near the main gate that week, chrome-polished menu, backlit sauces with fancy names. Its sizzle carried like a bell. Customers drifted that way. Grace packed up early. The ice chest felt heavier than usual. She pushed her cart toward the bus stop and told herself not to cry. Her apartment was a walk-up in a quiet part of the city. When she pushed open the door, the place looked like a motel room after a team of teenagers' shoes scattered a rain jacket flung over the dining chair, pizza boxes leaning on the sink, a sour smell rising from the drain. "Douglas," she called. No answer. He had retired from teaching last spring and immediately found a new career in being seen. Every evening he went to the community dance hall, styled his thinning hair, buttoned a crisp white shirt, and went live on Facebook to talk about posture, rhythm, and life after 60. The comments were full of hearts and fire emojis. He liked to read them aloud. Grace washed a glass and stared out the window. Through the glass, she could see the rain beginning delicate slashes across the parking lot. Her phone buzzed. A friend had sent a link. Douglas was live. She tapped. There he was, center of the community hall, lights bright as noon, a young dance instructor in a silky blue dress balanced on his arm. They moved to a slow waltz. Douglas, who had not carried groceries up these stairs in weeks, floated. As the camera panned, he turned and saw Grace in the doorway behind the phone. His smile fell like a coin. He lifted one palm and shooed the air small and sharp as if clearing smoke. "Go home," his hand said. "Not here. Not now." The humiliation landed like a slap. She closed the stream and stood very still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Dinner was quiet until it wasn't. He came home late, hair still shellacked, a hint of cheap cologne drifting behind him. He opened the fridge, frowned at the empty shelf, and pulled a bowl of leftover rice from the microwave. "Do you know," he said, "how embarrassing it is to have you show up in my live, thousands of people watching?" Grace set down the dish towel. Embarrassing for who? For the husband who told his wife to disappear. He laughed, not kindly. Jealousy at our age is unbecoming. He forked rice into his mouth and kept talking. "If this is so unbearable, let's just divorce. We can even make it fair, see which one of us the kids invite to live with them. Winner takes..." What dignity! Grace stared at him for a long time. "All right," she said. "Winner takes the quiet." They drew up papers with a clerk at the county office the next week. It felt unreal until a date appeared on a form, and a rubber stamp thudded down like a gavel. Douglas left the building lighter, almost jaunty. He began to call the children on the steps outside, pacing in the thin winter sun. First, Ethan, the oldest, who lived in a high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows and two small boys who could turn a living room into a trampoline park in 5 minutes. "Dad," Ethan said, "come stay with us a while. The boys will be thrilled." Douglas beamed. Next, Lucas, who ran an online clothing shop out of his suburban home, racks of dresses in the garage, heat lamps for product photos, ring lights shimmering in the hall. "Dad, I've been wanting you to mentor my team," Lucas said. "We'll set you up with a nice room." Douglas stood a little taller. Finally, Sophie, the youngest, who walked dogs part-time while studying design, and living in a studio that smelled faintly of coffee cinnamon and cat fur. "Dad, if you need a place, I've got a sofa bed," she said. "I'll make it work." Douglas hung up, smugness warming him like a coat. He didn't see the look Ethan gave the phone after the call, or the way Lucas pursed his lips in thought, or how Sophie stared at the ceiling for a long time, eyes prickling. They loved both their parents. They also knew their father's pride had grown sharp enough to cut. On the night before he left, they avoided each other out of habit, more than hostility, two satellites on different orbits. Grace folded his shirts without comment. He collected his old violin and a box of miniature stamps he had not looked at in a decade. In the morning, Ethan pulled up in a quiet hybrid. The boys buckled in back with juice boxes. Douglas stepped into the elevator without looking back. The door slid shut with the softest sigh. The apartment exhaled. Grace stood in the middle of the now quiet room, hands loose at her sides. The silence had weight, then lightness, like a quilt lifted off a sleeping body. She made tea. She washed the last 2 bowls. She opened a window and let the drizzle in. For the first time in years, she sat and did nothing, and it did not feel like failure. That week, she walked to the market alone and put a small yellow sign on her cart for sale. By afternoon, a kind woman who ran a community kitchen offered a fair price. Grace shook her hand and felt a knot she hadn't known was inside her begin to unknot. She joined the women's club down the street. They met in a library room with carpet that smelled like old books and rain. She signed up for an online herbal workshop. And on a breezy Thursday, Mrs. Lee from the next building introduced her to Dr. Frank, a retired college lecturer with the softest voice and a collection of heirloom tomatoes in his community garden plot. He brought her chicken soup when she had a scratchy throat. They walked the riverside path and talked about nothing urgent. Ethan's building had elevators that moved silently and a lobby plant that never seemed to wilt. The first afternoon, Douglas stood at the window of his new room and filmed the city skyline for his followers, narrating about the horizon, about fresh starts. The boys barreled in, hair sticking up, faces bright. Grandpa, do the robot, do it again. He laughed and did it again. The honeymoon ended the next morning. Ethan and his wife left early for work, apologizing and thanking him in the same breath. The older boy had online homework and a talent for minimizing windows the second an adult turned away. The younger one needed a snack every 20 minutes and called every packet of anything emergency crackers. At noon, Douglas opened the fridge and discovered 3 tidy rows of plastic containers labeled with dates. Were these cooked raw? He poked a lid. Condensation fogged. He decided to order takeout. Grandpa, do you even know how? The older one asked, patient and superior. The boy took Douglas's phone and set up 3 apps in 5 minutes, including mobile banking. Tap here, then here. Add tip. Don't forget tip. Dad says always tip. Within a week, Douglas had learned to approve grocery deliveries, reset a Wi-Fi router, and remove crayon from a wall with toothpaste. He had also learned that children do not nap on command, and that cartoons are apparently louder at 3 p.m. than any other hour of the day. His daily live streams shifted to late night after everyone slept, and the city dimmed when he could angle the phone so that the skyline glittered behind him, and the comments called him distinguished. Then came the call from Lucas. Dad, come down for a while, Lucas said. We have a guest room, and the yard's in bloom. Plus, I need your eye on some business processes. Douglas hung up and told the boys he would visit again soon. They tackled his knees, and he pretended the weight of them did not make his eyes ache with a tired kind of joy. Lucas's neighborhood smelled like cut grass and barbecue. When Douglas arrived, the front hall was taken over by garment racks, plastic-wrapped dresses, glinting like fish scales. The living room had been rearranged around 3 cameras and a stack of boxes. Lucas's wife waved from the dining table, headset on, typing furiously. "Welcome, Dad! We're in launch mode!" she mouthed, then darted back to a spreadsheet. Lucas was all charm and wheels within wheels. "Dad, we stream every night at 7. I want you to judge our scripts. Your teacher voice is perfect," he said. Douglas felt his chest puff. He had been a department head, a man of checklists and standards. He could guide, he could correct, he could matter. The first night was thrilling. He sat just off camera, watching Lucas banter about fabrics and fits, whispering cues, timing jokes, raising a penciled eyebrow when the energy sagged. Sales climbed in the chat window like a scoreboard. Lucas handed him a bottle of sparkling water, eyes bright. "See, you still got it." Douglas slept well, but helping once is volunteering, helping twice is a job. By the third day, Dad, can you check? The inbound boxes was normal. So was Dad, the shipping labels jammed again? And Dad, can you test the camera focus? And Dad, where did you put the tape gun? Douglas found himself sweating in the garage at noon, counting dresses while a leaf blower droned somewhere outside. One afternoon, the doorbell chimed. Lucas wasn't home. His wife was on a sales call. Douglas opened the door to find a trio of stern people in business attire. The woman in front held a clipboard. Mr. Douglas, she asked, we're here regarding an overdue supplier invoice for this address. We've attempted contact several times. She showed a statement. The total was large enough to make the numbers blur. If payment is not received today, we will have to escalate, including legal steps, including public disclosure. Douglas's jaw tightened. This must be a mistake. The woman's tone barely moved. We'd prefer to resolve quietly. He thought of Lucas's momentum of the stream of comments that could curdle in an hour. He thought of his own face online made small by scandal. Against his better judgment, he opened his banking app, astonished again at how easy it was to move money and send a deposit that made his fingers go cold. The trio thanked him with professional nods and left. He closed the door and stood very still. That night, Lucas came home flushed with sales data. When Douglas explained, Lucas's smile froze at the edges. Dad? You shouldn't have done that, he said softly. But... Thank you. He hugged Douglas too quickly and went upstairs. Douglas sat in the kitchen, the house suddenly bigger and emptier than it had been an hour ago. A week later, Sophie arrived in a sweater the color of moss hair, in a loose bun. Dad, come stay with me for a bit, she said. I could use the company. Her studio was on the third floor of a building that used to be a bakery. The hall held the ghost smell of sugar. Inside, a small dog with anxious eyes wagged a blur, and two cats watched from the back of the couch like carved sphinxes. The first morning, the dog had an accident. By afternoon, a cat had batted a glass tumbler off the counter. Sophie apologized and laughed and taught Douglas how to use the strange vacuum that looked like a small spaceship. They ate simple dinners, sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening to rain. At night, the city hummed outside. Douglas scrolled through videos of dancers in glittering shoes and tried to convince himself that this was a temporary chapter on the way to triumph. It was Angela who reminded him that the world could still shimmer. He had met her at the dance hall, Angela with bright lipstick, a low laugh, and a way of leaning in that made him feel young. She called him my gentleman. She liked his stories. She asked about his favorite records. Soon she began to appear on his live streams, a blur of blue dress in the background, a smile angled to the lens. "You're trending, babe," she whispered once, and his heart kicked like a teenager's. When she suggested he stay with her some nights to cut the commute, he did not say no. Portland had a heat wave that week. At the dance hall, the air conditioning failed, and the crowd kept dancing anyway, sweat bright on Temple's feet, sliding on a tacky floor. Douglas had not eaten much. He had not slept well in days. Under the lights, he waltzed too fast, spun too many times, and the room tilted. His knees vanished under him. He woke to a hospital ceiling, and Angela's lipstick smudged into a thin, worried line. "Don't scare me like that," she said, voice brittle. He tried to make a joke. It fell into the sheets between them. The first day, Angela fussed, posted a photo of their hands with a caption about fragility and love. By the third, the reality of care, bathroom trips, bad soup medicine charts had dimmed the romance. She began to answer calls in the hallway. On the fourth morning, she was gone. Grace arrived with Ethan as the nurse adjusted a drip. Sophie slipped in an hour later with a bag of oranges. Lucas came that evening with a magazine and sat quietly by the window. No one asked where Angela was. Douglas stared at the square of sky visible above the parking lot and listened to the murmur of family, the simplest song. In the garden outside, he sat with Grace on a bench. He spoke first. "I thought pride was a kind of armor," he said, voice rough. "It turns out it's a kind of blindness." Grace watched a pair of sparrows hop near a low hedge. "It can be," she said, "but eyes can open." He swallowed. "I'm sorry." She did not say for what. He didn't need a list. "It's not too late to do better," she said, "if you want to." He nodded. The nod felt like a heavy door swinging slow but sure. Back at Ethan's, Douglas unpacked with the gentleness of a guest who wants to deserve a home. He learned the rhythm of the dishwasher. He brewed tea before anyone asked. He started saying, "Can I help?" and meant it. At night, instead of live streams, he read to the boys doing all the voices and forgot to check the comments counter in his head. He called Lucas to ask about the invoice. There was a pause. "Dad, Lucas said we need to talk about that soon." Sophie texted him a photo of a plant in sunlight. "I repotted your old fern," she wrote. "It's coming back." He stared at the screen for a long time and then put the phone face down, palms covering it, as if warming a small bird. Autumn folded into the city. Leaves slid along sidewalks like quiet kites. The markets filled with pears and pumpkins. Grace met Dr. Frank on Saturdays at the community garden. They traded soups, they avoided labels. When Mrs. Lee teased Grace about her boyfriend, Grace smiled and said only, "I like peace." Thanksgiving Day arrived with cold sunlight and a sky as pale as paper. Ethan's dining table had to be extended with 2 leaves. Lucas brought trays from the oven, hair dusted with flour. Sophie set small candles in jam jars. Neighbors drifted in with foil-covered pans. Grace came last, a box of fried dumplings, steaming through its lid, a jar of pickled carrots bright as jewels. Douglas took a seat at the middle of the table and watched faces shine and blur and reappear as people moved around. He felt for a moment weightless, like a man sitting in the center of a small, private universe. When the first plates were filled, he reached for a dumpling. Crisp gave way to tender. "Still the best," he murmured. Grace heard him. "I made them for the family," she said. "Eat." But her voice had no thorn. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the children spun in circles in the hall, Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad," he said, "we want to share something." Lucas pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and set it on the table. Sophie leaned forward, picking at the label of a cider bottle. Grace looked from one face to another, calm and attentive. "Dad, Ethan began about that debt collector at our house." Lucas took a breath. "It was us," he said. "I hired my friend to play the part. I wanted you to stop throwing money at problems on impulse. I wanted you to see how fast pride can make you foolish." He tapped the envelope. "Every dollar you transferred is here. We kept it safe." Douglas blinked as if the room had brightened too quickly. His mouth opened, then closed. Sophie spoke next. "And my place," she laughed softly. "I made it worse on purpose so you would have to live with mess and not walk away. So you would help. So you would see what it's like when someone needs you and doesn't make a show of it. I love you. I needed you to learn a different kind of attention," Ethan added. "At our place, we didn't just need childcare. We needed you to be present, to look at us, not an audience." He looked down at his hands. "We're sorry we staged anything, but we wanted to keep our family." Douglas stared at the envelope as if it were a small animal that might move. In his chest, something loosened and stung at the same time. He heard distantly Grace's voice saying thank you to someone in the hallway, heard the kids arguing about slices of pie, heard a neighbor's laugh. He saw his life a long street with many turns and felt, without drama, the wish to walk it differently. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a plastic pension card. He placed it on the table palm, covering it for a second, as if saying goodbye to an old habit. He slid it toward Grace. "Hold this," he said. "Please." "Money isn't what I should be guarding." Grace looked at him for a moment, eyes steady. "All right," she said, "but understand it isn't a leash, it's a trust." He nodded once, a promise. The room swelled back into chatter. Someone turned on a record player. The needle found an old jazz song and the brass sounded like sunlight. Grace began to collect plates. Douglas stood and took half from her arms. "Sit," he said. "Let me." She raised an eyebrow. He didn't flinch. In the kitchen, steam rose around his hands. He washed until the sink gleamed. They did not remarry, there was no need. Paper had never prevented pain or ensured kindness. Instead, Douglas moved back into the apartment, slowly, careful as a cat, with fewer boxes than before. They drew simple lines. They cooked together and ate together most nights. On Thursdays, Grace went to the women's club while he picked up the grandkids from soccer practice. On Saturdays, she and Dr. Frank still met at the garden. Sometimes Douglas came along and traded tomato seedlings for a story about old records. No one needed a label to be gentle. At the dance hall, Douglas danced less and listened more. Once in a while, someone in the comments asked after Angela. He let the question pass like a cloud, sometimes watching a pair of newcomers practice a turn and laugh at the same mistake. He felt a pang not of jealousy, but of recognition. Life was always learning the weight of your own steps. One rainy evening, he and Grace took the long way home along the river. The city lights made the water look like melted stars. "Do you miss it?" Grace asked. What he said, the noise, he thought. Sometimes he said honestly, "But quiet used to scare me because it left room for regret. Now it feels like room for care." She nodded. The rain softened. They walked on side by side, the kind of silence that keeps you warm. The rest is ordinary, which is to say miraculous. Dinner on cheap plates that hold perfect food. A plant on the windowsill that refuses to die. A knock at the door, a grandchild racing in with a picture drawn in 3 colors. It turns out that after the thunder of pride fades, you can hear a softer thunder that has been there all along, the sound of a life steady, large and close. And sometimes that is all a happy ending needs. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Grace taped a small sheet of paper to the fridge. Not a lecture, just a list. Filter the water pitcher, take out recycling, wipe the stove after cooking, call the insurance office before Friday. Douglas read it like a person translating a new language. He took the trash out and noticed a loose hinge on the door of the bin. He found a screwdriver. He fixed it. It was small and, for some reason, satisfying. In the afternoon, he walked to the pharmacy for Grace's vitamins and returned with flowers. He set them in a jar, not a bouquet like a billboard's simple daisies. Grace glanced at them and then at him. "Thank you," she said. "They're cheerful." He realized he had spent years waiting for applause when what he actually wanted was this, a plain thank you that changed the air in a room. That night, they ate chicken soup at the small table by the window. The rain thickened against the glass. "Ethan wants me to pick up the boys from soccer on Thursdays," Douglas said. "Good," Grace replied. "They'll love it." He nodded, nervous and oddly excited, like his first day at a job he wanted to keep. On the bus to the field, Douglas watched raindrops race down the window, and uninvited a reel of memory began. Their 20s had been all hustle, second-hand furniture, weekend shifts, the thin joy of making rent by a nail's breadth. Grace had cooked for 5 on a budget for 2, and learned every cheap cut of meat like a friend. He had measured success by titles on doors and how many people stood up when he entered a room. When Ethan was born, he bought a briefcase and swore he'd never carry a plastic bag again, as if dignity could be purchased by material. Grace had been steady. He hadn't noticed steady because steady never made a speech. When Lucas struggled in school, she tutored him at the kitchen table, while Douglas told himself that big-picture people didn't do spelling lists. When Sophie cried through the night, for reasons no book could explain, Grace paced so Douglas could sleep for his morning meetings. He told himself he would make it up to her someday. Someday had stretched into a habit, and the habit had hardened into a posture he learned to call personality. He stepped off the bus and the cold air hit his teeth. On the field, 30 children swarmed like a school of fish, slippery and loud. His grandsons waved. The older boys scored. The younger one tripped and laughed at the grass. Douglas clapped until his palms stung and wondered how many small, ordinary wins he had missed by keeping score in the wrong game. It began with Ethan. They sat in the car after practice, the heater ticking. "I owe you an apology," Douglas said, "for making you feel like a babysitter instead of a son." Ethan kept his eyes on the windshield. "Thanks for saying it," he replied. "We can just try to be better at being in the same room." It was not cinematic. The relief still moved through Douglas like heat. Lucas listened in his warehouse-turned-living room, feet on an overturned box. "I wanted you to be proud," Lucas said, "and I wanted your help. Both can be true." "I tried to be impressive when I should have been useful," Douglas said. Lucas laughed once, surprised. "Then be useful now." They shook hands and didn't let go too quickly. Sophie made tea and put a saucer under Douglas's cup because the mug leaked. "You were the first person I wanted to text in the hospital," he admitted, "and I didn't because I was ashamed." Sophie bumped his shoulder with hers. "Text next time. You can be messy with me. I was born into mess." He grinned, the kind that crinkles the eyes. "I noticed." Grace woke earlier not because she had to, but because dawn felt like a good book. She rode the bus across the river to the community garden, where Dr. Frank volunteered on Saturdays, advising anyone who asked on soil and patience. They traded recipes, his corn chowder for her ginger chicken, and stories that had no moral except that time moves, and we move with it. One morning he asked, "Are you happy while thinning carrots?" Grace didn't rush to answer. "I'm quiet," she said finally, "which feels new and right." He nodded, brushed dirt from his fingers. "Quiet is a place you live in, not a thing you wait for," he said. They smiled in that way people do when they pass a mile marker they didn't know they needed. On a Tuesday, someone knocked. Grace wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door to find Angela, hair immaculate, smile rehearsed. "Is Douglas home?" she asked, peering past Grace into the apartment as if a camera might be rolling. Grace stepped aside, neither welcoming nor blocking. "He's at the store. I can wait," Angela said already, halfway inside. She perched on the edge of a chair like a swan in a parking lot. "I just want to say things got complicated." "I was scared," Grace replied evenly. "Hospitals are complicated. Most people learn to be brave there." Douglas returned with paper bags that smelled like oranges and coffee. He stopped in the doorway. "Angela." She stood and tilted her head an angle that used to work. "We were good together," she said. "We could be again." Douglas set the bags down, lined up the bananas on the counter, buying time with trivial order. "We were exciting," he said, "but not good." Her smile flickered. "I have soup," Grace said into the quiet. "You're welcome to a bowl, and then you should go." Angela declined the soup, and the dignity. She left in a rustle of perfume, a movie ending without credits. Douglas started volunteering at the senior center on Thursdays, not to dance in the spotlight, but to walk new members to their seats and carry water bottles and say, "You're doing fine," to anyone whose cheeks flushed with frustration. He learned to measure a successful night by the number of people who smiled while leaving, not the number who clapped during. Sometimes he showed a couple how to pivot without stepping on each other. "Look up, not down," he'd say. "You'll feel where your partner is if you let yourself." He had finally learned what that sentence meant. After class, he would sit on the steps outside and watch the bus brake lights blink red in the dark. He texted Grace, "Need anything on my way home?" She'd reply, "Milk, or just you." He walked, slower, warmer. 2 weeks into December, Ethan called. "Dad, the school just phoned. There was a problem. Some teasing went too far. Can you pick up Oliver? He's embarrassed." Douglas arrived to find his grandson, red-eyed, chin lifted in that brave, foolish way children use when the ground shakes. They drove to a diner, and split pancakes at 3 in the afternoon because pancakes at wrong hours cure some kinds of shame. Douglas told him about the time a student had mocked his suit and how he'd pretended not to hear and then gone home and laughed because the kid was right. Oliver snorted, then laughed for real. The sound loosened a knot Douglas hadn't known he carried behind his ribs. Lucas finally asked his father to look at the books, not the costume ones, the money ones. They sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and an old-fashioned calculator that thunked instead of clicked. "Here's what you do well," Douglas said first, pointing. "Here's what you do dangerously." They made a plan with margins, not miracles. They returned the stage debt in installments to where it had come from an envelope in Grace's drawer that felt to Douglas like a communal heart. Afterward, Lucas said, "Dad, I didn't want to trick you. I didn't want to be the kind of man who needed tricking," Douglas replied. They both looked relieved to have said the hard parts out loud. Sophie's art teachers organized a small gallery night in a cafe that smelled of espresso and new paint. Her pieces, collages of found receipts and thin gold thread, hung at eye level and made ordinary purchases look like constellations. The dog sat under a chair with a bandana on. The cats were mercifully at home. "Don't cry," Sophie warned Douglas, seeing his face. "You'll make me cry." "I make no promises," he said, and he bought the smallest piece and asked her to sign the back. She wrote, "For Dad, who learned to look." A windstorm rolled in 4 days before Christmas, wild and unruly. Power flickered and went out across half the neighborhood. Ethan's place lost heat. Lucas's street was blocked by a fallen tree. Grace lit candles and stacked blankets. By evening, the apartment was crowded with people and casseroles and 2 sleeping bags that smelled faintly of campfire and detergent. Sophie's dog trembled under the table until Douglas made a tent from a quilt and read aloud by phone light. The words landed like snow. They ate soup, warmed on the gas stove, and told the kind of stories you only tell when anything brighter than a flame feels extravagant. In the dark, someone began to hum a carol, and several voices joined. No one harmonized well. It was perfect. On New Year's Day, Douglas stood at the counter, coffee steaming, and said, "People keep asking if we'll get remarried." Grace folded a dish towel. "People like labels. They're easier to shelve." He smiled. "Do you want to?" She considered. "No," she said gently. "I want to stay. And I want you to stay. That is already the promise." He nodded, a man who had chased applause, learning to love an answer no crowd could hear. They spent the afternoon taking ornaments off the thrift store tree they had decorated with old photos and paper cranes. When they reached the top, Douglas held the chair steady, while Grace stretched on her toes. "Don't fall," he said. "I'm not falling," she replied. "I'm reaching." And he realized the difference. Spring slid in soft as a whisper. The farmer's market reopened with the first strawberries, and Grace returned not to sell, but to walk, to taste samples, to wave at people who used to be customers and were now friends. Someone asked if she would ever run a stall again. "I ran it long enough," she said, smiling. "Now I run my mornings." Douglas kept volunteering at the senior center. One afternoon, a nervous man arrived alone and asked if it was too late to learn. "Not at all," Douglas said, offering a hand. "We start by standing." They did. It was enough for day 1. At home, the apartment learned their new rhythm. He brewed coffee, she watered the plant that refused to die. They ate on cheap plates with perfect food. They argued sometimes about the noise of the kettle, about whose turn it was to call the plumber about nothing and everything that means you are alive with someone. They apologized sooner than they used to. Ethan's boys grew taller. Lucas's business grew steadier. Sophie's dog aged into a gentler pace and sometimes slept at Douglas's feet, dreaming soft dreams that made his paws twitch. Dr. Frank taught Grace how to coax tomatoes through a week of unexpected cold. Grace taught him how to make dumplings that didn't burst at the edges. They all fit somehow, like puzzle pieces from different boxes, that still made a picture when you were patient. One evening, not remarkable for anything, Douglas stood at the sink and rinsed a plate. Water hissed and ran a sound like a small summer storm on a tin roof. Behind him, Grace hummed something he didn't recognize. He turned off the tap and listened. It occurred to him that he had spent many years waiting for claps and bright lights, and the quick sugar rush of being seen. What he had now was harder to stage and easier to keep an armful of quiet tasks, a household of intertwined hours, people who would call, not because he was impressive, but because he would show up. He dried the plate. He set it in the cupboard. He exhaled. In the other room, a phone buzzed with a photo from Sophie, her latest collage, a bus ticket, a scrap of a grocery list, a pressed leaf. Under it, she had written in tiny ink a map of where we live now. Douglas smiled and carried 2 cups of tea to the table. Outside, the sky held its breath blue, deepening toward night. Inside, the ordinary thunder rolled on, steady and close, which turned out to be the sound of a life.